Fourth book. Oh, we're live. Okay, welcome everyone. We got a packed house tonight for Moll's PhD dissertation, I believe, on Marcion, called "At the Left Hand of Christ, the Arch-Heretic something or other." Let me go back and look at the title because I forget the whole title. "At the Left Hand of Christ, the Arch-Heretic Marcion." Yeah. Published in 2009, and basically it's his. I don't know if you call it a monograph, would you? It's his work on Marcion, essentially. Yeah, Marcion's life. Yeah, his biographical information, his theology, basically everything about Marcion. And we read from the intro to the end of part 2, which was, I forget the chapter titles. Let me peek.
Laura, I think.
The first part was problems with sources, so it went over like Polycarp's second letter to the Philippians, Ptolemy's letter to Flora, the Elder and Irenaeus's against heresies, the Carmelians against Marcion. Yeah, yep. That means the Carmelians. I didn't know
that. Would the group like me to quickly go over who Moll is?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, Sebastian Moll was born in 1980. He graduated in 2000 from the Apostolic School in Kolgwindenl. He became a fellow of a very long German university, whose name I can't pronounce. He studied from 2001 to 2005 Protestant theology at Friedem Wells University, Bonn. But he went to the University of Edinburgh in the United Kingdom to complete his master's, which he received master's distinction. And from 2006 to 8, he was working on research for what would become his work on Marcion, and in 2009 he graduated from the University of Edinburgh with his PhD. We are reading that doctoral thesis. In 2014 he was given a research associate's position at the University of Mainz, and he has recently finished a book studying Albert Schweitzer and Schweitzer's impact of the last 100 years on historical and biblical studies. So there you go.
Cool. Some good background on him.
Daniel, I was surprised to hear that he had written his master's dissertation as a play. Very unusual.
Yes, meet Marcion.
That was interesting.
Yeah, that's what he talked about, the preface of this, right? That was what you're talking about. Yeah.
Loretta, did you read the play?
I've read the introduction and I think the first 3 parts of the first chapter.
Yeah, according to my conversation with Moll on Facebook, they performed it at Oxford, and apparently he had one of the bishops like rolling in the aisle. Apparently it's a very good comedy from what people have told him. So I don't know, but it is really interesting to do it, and I'd love to read the whole thing. And if it's as funny as he makes it out to be, it would be pretty cool to see it performed.
Is it available on DVD anywhere for the Oxford performance?
I'm not sure. I might ask him for that, Wayne. I'll get back to
you. Yeah, so we also read part 2, I guess you'd say, Marcion's life, dealing with what we know about his biographical details, where he was born, when he arrived in Rome, what his profession was, etc. So, anyway, throwing it open, what do you guys think of, so we'll just go in order, the intro.
How does this work, by the way? Because this is the first book that I
read for these Hangouts? Like, what's the format?
Usually, sorry. I would say usually Doug leads us, and he'll throw out questions, and that can either spiral into a very big conversation that what we liked, what we didn't like, based on the question. Sometimes it can be really short and sweet. Oh yeah, we all liked it. And then somebody might come with something pre-prepared, like, so what did you guys think about this? So yeah, he's gone.
Yep, he's having some issues with connections, so.
I think from like a major standpoint, it is really interesting when I sort of took Moll at his word that no major monograph has been done on Marcion, like a major, his life, his theology, his work, his impact, that nothing had been really done for such a long time. And I was like, really? And I searched, and it was like, yeah, there's just nothing. So I think right from the get-go, it was a good idea. I think if I was a doctoral supervisor looking at the state of Marcionite studies and how little there had been, and somebody like Moll was like, I think we need to do an evaluation and see where we're at and what we can know now we've done all these studies, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I like that he kind of went through some of the major works that had come out between from Harnack up to basically his work, and talked about. It seems like a lot of them were just kind of rehashes of Harnack, with some slight modifications here and there, but nothing comprehensive, like you were saying, since Harnack.
I think like he really cements that, like, and I got this from my own study, but anyone who wants to approach Marcion has to approach him through Harnack first, almost. Like, that's just the way.
For a second here, because
yeah, sure.
I am actually, I have to say, I think John invited me into this hangout assuming that I knew a lot more than I actually know. Can somebody like maybe link me to a good comprehensive Marcion 101 type article? Because my knowledge of Marcion is basically, my knowledge of his theology is that he was sort of Gnosticish and didn't like Yahweh very much. And he had a lot of conflicts with the church because he was sort of Gnosticish and didn't like Yahweh very much.
Actually, pretty much the best Marcion 101 text is what we're reading for this hangout, is Moll's text.
Oh my God.
It's it's a somewhat in-depth one.
I'm not that far into it, but it just seems like Moll is assuming that the reader has a lot more background knowledge than somebody with a year of community college would normally have.
That's cool. All levels are welcome.
This is actually a pretty good introduction.
Yeah, I'm glad you posted your thing, Daniel.
Oh, thank you, Daniel.
Daniel's article is really good, and it's a lot more brief and a really good summary too. So that's a good place if you want something shorter that sums up stuff.
So Daniel, for a bit of history here, how well was Harnack received in his own time?
What's that, sorry?
For a bit of history here, what was the situation before Harnack studies, and how well was he received in his own time?
Okay. Basically, nobody really studied Marcion in any great detail. When you look at sort of pre-Harnack, Marcion gets mentioned a lot by the Tübingen School of Thought with Bauer and all the usual suspects associated with the 19th century sort of Tübingen School. But that's the thing, that they're studying him. They're not really... they're making references to him, they're talking about him, but they're not doing what someone like Harnack and Moll have done, where they're devoting huge amounts of single-minded, focused research on him. The other thing is they're pretty much assuming he's a heretic, that he's wrong, he's incorrect, he's an offshoot, and even though a lot of what F.C. Bauer did with the Tübingen School of Thought was to bring that classical study of religion to biblical studies, a lot of that was like restricted to the New Testament. Even when we got into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, things weren't really given their just due about heresy and orthodox Gnostics. It still wasn't as a formulaic as we come to it these days, with a lot more grey. Harnack changed that. Harnack was one of the very first people to be like, Marcion is a figure to be reckoned with, and he deserves our attention. I think that puts it in terms of how well he was received. He was pretty much like really universally received very well, at least for his efforts, because nobody had done this on Marcion. In England and in France and in Germany, particularly Germany, pretty much everybody, when they wanted to look at Marcion, as you can kind of tell from Moll's work, they had to approach Marcion through Harnack because of just the detail and study Harnack had done. In England, he did get a bit of criticism, which you'll probably get to when you look at the reception and further study of Marcionite work, particularly when we get to someone like Blackwell. You can kind of see that in the English world, Harnack does start to get criticized, but he's still the norm. He's still pretty much the norm, and he still is today. Yeah. Sorry if I'm rambling.
And for the other people here who aren't good with the background on Marcion, I'll ask some more basic questions to you. What manuscripts do we have of Marcion's writings?
Absolutely zero.
That's part of the problem here. Yeah. So how do we deal with that?
Well, Moll basically lays that in a later section, but we basically have to read very carefully between the lines of how much we can trust our sources, and that's one of the reasons why I love studying Marcion personally.
And yeah, that's the key thing. Very carefully between the lines, because virtually everything we have on Marcion is anti-Marcion, right?
Yeah, it's like Doug. Doug was this major figure, but the only thing we have about Doug comes from his enemies. So how much can we really trust? I might think Doug is a good guy, but none of my writings have survived. So yeah, it's interesting to think about. It's like we only know of Obama through the Republicans. So
yeah. Did you guys want to go into any detail as far as in the introduction, his specific summaries of some of the other earlier scholars' work on Marcion? Like, did you guys want to pick anything out that you liked in those sections? They're really short.
Actually, Doug, do you mind if right before his abstract of thesis, which even before he even got into his introduction, that's even right before the table of contents, I think, he had something that I thought was fascinating, and I think it seems like something to go into the study with. He says, I don't know if you see it on page 6, abstract of thesis, and it's the second paragraph, and it's in italics. It says, Marcion does not understand the Old Testament in the light of the New. He interprets the New Testament in the light of the Old. And I thought that's going to be, I think, the fundamental basis on which Marcion developed a difference in seeing the different type of God portrayed in the Old Testament. And he took that and ran with it, realizing this is different from the God of Jesus Christ, the God and Father, who had not been revealed. And he took that and ran with it. To me, that's my understanding of the key significance of Marcion to anyone else.
You're dead right. Like, that's the major thing. But the key point is what Moll puts in italic is what's fundamentally different between him and Harnack. That's what you point out, because for Harnack, it's all about Paul. Marcion sees himself as the heir to Paul's gospel, that he receives the truest, in the truest sense, he receives what Paul was all about and takes it to its next logical conclusion. That it's all about, that it's, you know, like he basically reads the Old Testament in the light of Paul. So, but what Moll argues is that's wrong. Moll thinks that it's not exact. Paul isn't his starting point, which is what makes him very different. So it's an interesting new approach to Marcion that Moll has presented will be his overarching thesis.
One of the things that I found interesting about Moll, and I'm not sure how much Harnack differed on this particular point, but how Marcion viewed the Old Testament. Like, obviously what Dale just read, that Moll's taking the approach of viewing it from the perspective that Marcion was interpreting the New Testament through the Old Testament, or through the lens of the Old Testament, if you want to say that. But he's still considering that scripture to some degree, right? And Moll says he was a biblicist, and so he considered that, like, I don't know if it was scripture, but it was true history, I guess you could say. Yeah. So what's the main difference there between, like, if there is one, between Moll's reconstruction of how Marcion viewed the Old Testament and how Harnack, like, I see the difference that Harnack said Marcion was really all about Paul, but on just strictly the Old Testament view of Marcion.
Well, the thing is, what's different is Harnack sets up the God of the Old Testament as all about law, not evil. Right? That's what's different between them. Harnack's God is all about, because he reads Paul, he reads this theme of law and grace. He reads Galatians, and it's all about, you know, works of the law, works of righteousness, faith in Jesus Christ. So Harnack is all about Paul is the main thing. And it's not so much that the God of the Old Testament is evil, he's just a lawmaker, he's just a judge. He just sets up these laws that no one could possibly hold, therefore we have the God of Jesus Christ. And Harnack sets up Marcion like a 2nd century Martin Luther. And John is absolutely right. For Harnack, he's the penultimate Protestant. Like, Marcion is the best version of Protestantism. What makes Moll different is that he views the Old Testament through the lens of the New, in the sense that the God of Jesus is love and grace and peace, and the God of the Old Testament is wicked and evil and sinister. Harnack didn't say that. Harnack is more like, he's about rules, this guy's about freedom. And because he's a God, the rules are the rules, but because of Jesus, we can escape that and have freedom. So it's not that it's sort of like having a boss. We don't like having bosses, but we have them. But Moll says that's wrong. Moll thinks that, no, this God is basically an evil, vengeful, wicked, warmongering, evil God that we find in the Old Testament. Like, that's the fundamental difference. Have I made that clear?
Yeah, but in Harnack's view and Moll's view, that Marcion considered the Old Testament scripture, is that right? Just kind of different, whether it's a God of law or God of evil.
Yeah. Sorry, I got distracted with that. Yes, Harnack and Moll think that Marcion would have respected the Old Testament enough to read them, to consider them. After all, you know, he did believe, as you said, they were true history in a sense, that you know, Adam really did exist, and the God of the Israelites really did have to go for all that stuff. You know, yeah, it's he definitely would have read them. After all, that's how he got to his conclusions. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure because I read Harnack. I was curious.
That's a question you should ask him when we get to him.
I thought it was interesting that he suggested that Harnack revered Marcion so much that he says he actually loved him, not just respected, but so that he imposed his own theological perspective onto Marcion.
That's the big claim everybody says about Harnack. yeah, you can reading his English work, Marcion and the Alien God, even in English, that comes across that he clearly is in love with this idea of Marcion. And I think Moll's observation that because Harnack was both an historian and a theologian, that probably did get in the way. I think he's pretty right on about that, in my opinion. What I'm particularly interested in, of all the people who he studies, the one he is the most critical of is Joseph Hoffman's Marcion on the Restitution of Christianity. Like, more than any other work previous to him, that's the one he has the most criticisms of, which I find very interesting. And what I find even more interesting is when Hoffman's second edition comes out soon, and Hoffman says he's got a lot of updating to do, I'm really interested to see how much Moll's criticisms have made an impact. So that's something I found highly fascinating.
Yeah, because Hoffman seems to be one of the guys that Moll really kind of takes to task in a big way.
Yeah. Because it's interesting because Hoffman, similar to Moll, previously to Hoffman, as you can see in Moll's summaries, once again, there's really not that much studies. Like, you've got Hoffman in 84, and the last big book on Marcion is 73. Like, for like scholarly research, how many books on Paul and Jesus are published every year? You know, how many books just on Romans alone, or the Gospel of Mark? So yeah, it's really interesting, like, that this subject, the character Marcion is of little subject, and Hoffman's.
Uh-oh. Did we lose Daniel?
Looks like it.
Well, I'll take this opportunity to ask if anyone's...
Marcion's role with Gnosticism gets a chapter. Marcion's role in the legacy of making heretics and identifying heretics gets a chapter. So even though the major part of Hoffman's work is about the earlier dating, it's very similar in tone to the major subject of Marcion.
I just want to interject real quick for anyone that's not watching the side chat. Leon would really like to get back in if he can, because he wants to say a few things. And I know a couple people in here don't have mics or video or haven't read, but I'm just it's not compulsory. I'm just saying if anyone wants to make room, feel free, because he does kind of want to get back in to make some comments. Also, Reuven, if you're listening, I don't know how to get the live feed link. I see in the Facebook group that, yeah, there it is. Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. And for those of you, we talked about it earlier, but one of you might be wondering, like, well, why is he so critical of Hoffman? What's so special at Hoffman? Basically, what's really special about Hoffman, is that basically Hoffman suggested that Marcion was born in about the year 70, and that was a radically new idea. Most dating for Marcion had placed him, I think, around the 100s or something. So to put him as early as 70 was a really big deal, because it changed a lot of the dates and the players and the impact of Marcion moving around the Roman Empire and the shaping of the New Testament. So it was a really big deal when it came out.
Yeah.
Didn't he also suggest that Marcion had never been to Rome, which is practically the only thing about his history that we can know practically for a fact?
Yeah, it's he suggested it. The chapter that's in, he doesn't really invest a lot in the idea, but he suggests it. He does suggest that maybe Marcion never went to Rome, or if he did, he never left. He went there and died pretty much. He died in relative obscurity, but his legacy took off after his death. So yeah, that's another one of the major things that Moll has a major problem with.
May I?
Yeah, by all means, yeah.
Okay. Before I get cut off, I have some criticisms of Moll. And my first one, I just wrote this down, so I'm going to just read it as I just wrote it. It says, my main criticism of Moll, my first one. He shares that annoying nonchalance with which apologists are prone to take the granted points that are in fact, for granted, points that are in fact racked with controversy as if they were undisputably favorable to the traditional Christian position. A glaring example on page 46 where he says, I got it on my Kindle so I can just read it off of here. He says, Marcion performed textual criticism by cleaning the Gospel of Luke and the Pauline letters from what he believed to be Judaist interpolations. I think he needs to demonstrate that before he can say that.
Yeah, that was the traditional view of Marcion, that he edited down parts of the Bible. But yeah, right. Modern scholars are coming to question that quite significantly. Daniel and I were both recently reading another book called The First New Testament by Jason Dune.
Yeah, I read it too. That's a great book.
And he counters that a little bit in there.
Yes.
The evidence seems to be that Marcion used a biblical text that he had available to him and made few, if any, changes to them.
In Moll's defense, he will get to it in chapter 4, he says. I do agree that it is a bold statement to make, and then just to say, I'll get to it later in chapter 4. So I hear where you're coming from, but he does say he'll get to it eventually.
Yeah, but I mean, part of my criticism also, after that, I have my Kindle, so I'm able to, I have one of the old ones with the letters, so I can notate things. And I found myself highlighting a bunch of places that I can go through them. I can go through all these, but I basically, I'll say that he seems to hedge a lot. He hedges a lot throughout the first 2 chapters. I'll give some examples. I'll just page through these little phrases that he has. Little like a phrase he does. This is a phrase he uses. Does not show the traits. No, that's not it. Hold on. He uses phrases like "it is conceivable," or "it seems safe to say," or "it seems quite possible," or let me see. It's hard to imagine, and it seems possible. There is no direct contradiction. He uses all these hedging phrases, and it seems to me that he makes a little case for something. He tries to bring a case up, and before he can actually demonstrate it, he assumes that by just making a case, he's demonstrated, and then he moves on. And then he kind of assumes that he already made the case when he really hasn't. As a matter of fact, there are a couple of places in the book where I kind of got pissed off when he wrote, well, we just demonstrated such and such, and I wrote, no, you didn't.
When I came across those, in fact, I wish I could find it right away, but I probably won't be able to. There was one part at the beginning, I don't remember if it was in the introduction or right at the beginning of Marcion's problem of sources, but basically he kind of made like a what would you call it, like basically a statement of his approach, saying that, you know, he finished going over some of the sources that are in dispute, or under major dispute, I guess you could say. But he said, like, you know, that basically, I'm just really summarizing, you know, our sources are not exactly perfect. Some of them aren't really even close to perfect. So he's basically saying, like, you know, we're doing the best. I'm trying to do the best reconstruction I can do based off of the materials we have to work with.
Right.
And
except that he always, almost without fail, always chooses the traditional interpretation. He doesn't, he barely mentions John Knox, and I think John Knox knocks him out of the water in his book.
Yeah, I haven't read Knox. I do remember he mentioned a little bit, but I thought his equivocating remarks I thought he was just kind of being careful with those, making sure that the reader understood that, hey, this is not certain. This is kind of just my feel on where this evidence seems to be pointing. It's not certain. And
I wouldn't mind that. I wouldn't mind that at all. Except I think that he goes on to he says, okay, we don't really know this, but let's keep building on this theory as though this was true, and it kind of bugs me.
I totally agree with Doug that when I read it, I actually really appreciated that language because I don't think he was hedging his bets. I just think he was being careful, and most of his conclusions, particularly about the life of Marcion, I think it's clear to me anyway that he doesn't really invest that much in them. I don't think he would stake his career on a lot of his claims about the life of Marcion. I do get what you're saying about he just kind of builds upon a lot of the traditional mainstream opinions about Marcion, but I think that probably comes because he trusts his sources a little bit more. He leans more on the trustworthy side than the skeptical side for whatever reason, and I don't see apologetics behind that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, apologetics is probably the wrong word to use, but I do see a slight tinge of apologetics in that almost without fail he winds up going down that road of traditional interpretation via Harnack and via just the Tertullian, basically. He basically takes Tertullian, he hedges his bets. He says we don't really know, but Tertullian's probably right.
Well, I think he says that because in his sources he says that because Tertullian is a fairly early source, and he does make the point. He tries to argue the point, for better or for worse, that he doesn't think Tertullian is purposely distorting things on what's the word? He thinks that Tertullian is not intentionally distorting the data against Marcion, compared to someone like Irenaeus, for example.
Yeah, but I think it's true, at least from my reading of Marcion and the different readings I've done, including Baydun and Knox. It seems pretty clear to me that Tertullian is a polemic, and that's a problem.
Well, that's the whole thing about the sources. They all could be heavily polemical. I mean, that's just we're dealing with these ancient sources. A lot of them have agendas, and what are you going to do? I mean,
have you ever read the whole Tertullian on Marcion though?
No, I'm just barely scratching the surface of all this stuff.
Well, the way he begins his whole piece on Marcion, he's talking about Pontus and how it's the most horrible place in the world and only a sick person could come from there, and it's really weird. I remember reading it thinking, what the hell's wrong with this guy?
Yeah, but I mean, you get that even in Josephus, he's saying that it was an accident that the temple burned down, but that doesn't mean that's obviously wrong.
I get that.
But that doesn't mean we throw away Josephus,
No, it doesn't. No, I don't mean to throw away Tertullian, but I think we should be really, really careful about taking his word on anything.
Yeah, and that's what I think that.
I think Moll is careful to do that, though. I think I don't understand why you're being so critical when I think Moll's being pretty fair to his sources. And
I think he's being fair, but I think he's being cursory. I think he's skimming over things.
Could we be more specific in this conversation here? I mean, exactly what is it that you would want to doubt that Tertullian claims about Marcion? If you want to say, well, he accepts too much of Tertullian, well, what is it specifically that you think we might not want to accept?
Oh, wow. See, that's a hard question, though, because we're talking about a whole big subject here. Just his general, I think Tertullian's general take on Marcion is not objective in the least. I think his agenda is polemic. And I think if we start listening to what he says and saying, well, it's probably right, I think that anytime that you're listening to a polemic, it's kind of like when you're reading the New Testament and you're reading about how shitty the Pharisees are. I have a problem with that. I don't believe the New Testament about the Pharisees.
Yeah, but Moll says they're polemical. He says they're written by his enemies, so we've got to be careful. And
then he's not careful. See,
no,
he's got to be careful, and then he's not careful.
He then says it could be this way. Like, yeah, he uses a lot of that language that you have a problem with because he's trying to be careful.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. But using the language, but nevertheless, in almost every single instance, he drives right down the Tertullian lane.
Well, okay. Well, let's give you the point. He usually agrees with Tertullian. Would you like to give us a specific example where you think Moll is wrong to do so?
Yes, I think that I follow John Knox and Beydoun in saying that I take the case of Tertullian, Beydoun, and to some extent people like David Trobisch who have a different theory, who seem to think that it's just as likely, as a matter of fact, it's a parallel thing that happened back then. It's not that Marcion cut the Gospel of Luke, is that they both had versions of Gospel of Luke that were different to each other and they built upon.
Yeah, I agree entirely with that, but I don't think it affects a lot of the other things that Moll's talking about. I mean, like the question of when Marcion was born, I mean, it's not relevant to that.
That, and I would also point out that Beydoun's book came out in 2013, and Moll finished his thesis in 2009.
No, yeah, no, I understand that too. Yeah, so he couldn't respond to that. I understand that.
Yeah, too. I agree that he does not reference Knox a lot yet, and I agree that he does, like, that whole editing thing, hence why I'm very curious, even though I know what's coming up because I've read Moll's dissertation, when we get to chapter 4 and he claims that Marcion is an editor of Luke, when we get to that chapter, I think we can talk about that in comparisons to Knox and Beydoun's theory, and when we get Moll in the Hangout, we should ask him, has he read Beydoun's work and how does he feel about it? I think this is a really good, a good question to ask him.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think he definitely tends to, I mean, he's got all these sources out in front of him. And yeah, I think you're right, he tends to, for whatever reason, he tends to find Tertullian on several of the points to be the most, in his opinion, reliable account of one detail or another. But I think he is careful to go through the reasons. Like he does in the work lay out the reasons. You know, we might disagree with that. He'll say, like, dismiss Justin Martyr's testimony about Marcion being older when he was in Rome, and older than Basilides and Valentinus and all them. But he kind of says, well, that's not, or that his gospel had been spread wide even before he got to Rome, stuff like that. Like he talks about all that stuff, and yeah, he does kind of say, well, we have to be really careful with that, and he does side with Tertullian a little bit, and that's fine. Like you can definitely disagree with that, but I think he is using that language to say, like, look, this isn't certain. This is just where the evidence is leading me, Moll. You know.
Yeah, and I also, but as a side note too, I think he's being a little bit. I think he's a little bit unfair toward Hoffman.
Yeah, I somewhat agree with that. I think out of, like, you left, well, you got dropped out. I pointed out that out of all the previous Marcionite scholars, Hoffman's the one he takes to task more than any other. So I'm very curious, A, to talk to him about that,
Yeah.
but also when Hoffman brings out his second edition of his book, and Hoffman has said that he's made a lot of edits and a lot of changes, and his new preface is like 53 pages. I'm really curious if Moll had any, what criticisms of Moll he took on board, what he's holding his guns to, what he's adapted. So I'm excited to get the second edition of that. But I agree that, yeah, he's very, very critical of Hoffman.
Moll's language reminds me of the language that Hoffman uses against mythicists.
Yes, thank you. That's kind of what I hear. Thank you.
I think a lot of Moll's language, though, is just being tactful because he's disagreeing with earlier scholars on so many things that he wants to just be respectful of them and say, you want me to consider this alternative. I mean, I haven't done enough research to be certain about it yet, but I think it's more likely than what you have, and it should be a better consideration. Is what he's trying to say.
The other thing is, I get it, but because I'm in this stage myself, and people have accused me of, using wishy-washy language in my master's thesis. But this is his doctoral thesis. This is his big debut. So we're kind of trained to be really respectful of people, and we're at this point in our careers we can't really hedge our bet. Well, we can't really invest too much.
What I thought was funny though is he's trying to be respectful, but he's slamming Hoffman.
He does take Hoffman to task for sure in a big way.
I think he's a good sport about it. I mean, I think he takes him to task on things that are relevant to the subject matter.
Absolutely.
But I mean, he's civil with them. I mean, yeah.
You mean where he says his book basically is, an unedited first draft of a dissertation? Is that being respectful?
Right. Thank you. That's my point.
Well, but he did kind of give some decent reasons as to why. Whether they're true or not, I don't know. But I mean, if what he said is true,
it
was nitpicking, but still, I mean.
Anyway, I think we jumped a little ahead of where you want to be at this point in the Hangout. I think there's still more basic stuff about Marcion that we should have explained for the people here listening who have less background knowledge in the subject.
So yeah, way over me.
Yeah, before we do that, I just wanted to tell Leon, since it looks like your connection's somewhat stable now, which is good, but I think you dropped right as you were asking a question about like the general format, and I'll just say it now since you're here and it looks like you're stable. Like usually what we'll do is we'll typically, like there's no strict framework that we follow, but typically we'll kind of go in reading order and discuss points or highlights that we've got, and say like in the introduction, and then in part 1 and part 2 or whatever, we'll kind of go through it. But I mean, you can jump around, but we in general we kind of want to try and give it a sequential like structure, but it's not strict or anything. But I'm just saying that's like our North Star kind of.
Okay, thank you. That's cool. I'd like to actually ask a question. I'd like to take a head count. How many people have read Knox's book? No one.
I've read one chapter of it. It's expensive and it's out of print. I would love to, but yeah.
It should be in libraries, in some university libraries.
Is this the famous John Knox?
Not that one.
Not
the crazy.
Not the 16th century John Knox?
No. Marcion in the New Testament.
1943, I think.
What's the book called, Leon?
Marcion in the New Testament.
Yeah. Because I think, just from my reading of Moll so far, obviously I've only read the first 2 chapters, but it just seems so... just Knox is just so much better.
I can't compare. So.
Well, if you'd like,
I've never read it.
I highly recommend it to you guys.
All of it will be great.
I highly recommend it. If you can find it in your university library, I highly recommend that book.
Yeah. Thank you for your input, Leon. But at this point, I think we need to get onto the book we decided to read, which is Moll.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah,
that's cool.
But no, yeah, I appreciate the heads up on that book, because I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah, but I did want to cover some more just very basics for people. I'll just play devil's advocate with Daniel here a little bit.
Sure.
So what things did Marcion write that we no longer have?
Well, the major thing that's attributed to Marcion is a wonderful little book that the people call the antithesis. What's the antithesis, you might be wondering? Well, Marcion collected a gospel, or edited it. He's accused of editing the Gospel of Luke, and he's accused of patching together certain letters attributed to Paul together in this wonderful bundle which you could call a New Testament. But heck, the New Testament is hard to understand. Well, Marcion had a solution by packaging his New Testament together with a book called the Antithesis, which would supply you with everything you needed to know to understand this complicated theological narrative and letters from about Jesus and from Paul. However, nothing from the Antithesis has survived save one line, we believe, which is the opening line. I can't remember what it is. Somebody quotes it, but the opening line of the Antithesis is the only line that has survived, maybe.
That's kind of sad, but...
Can you guys... I'm going to post a PDF file in the chat. It's a really good encapsulation by Bedouin that you guys should also read.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. The other thing, Leon, is this is our first hangout for this book, and we're planning to stay on this book for like a month. And some of the stuff you're bringing up might be some things you want to talk about in later hangouts.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, we went over the introduction basically. Like, did you have any more like background stuff, Wayne, or anybody that you wanted to kind of establish before we really jump into the reading?
Well, I wanted people to know about the antithesis. I mean, Daniel, another question is, why is Marcion significant? I mean, why did he just get forgotten quickly after his time? I mean, was he influential in the 2nd century?
Yes.
Marcion's a big deal because when we look at the letters of Paul in the 1st century, we can clearly see there are problems. There are rabblings and disagreements, and there's fights going on. But even amongst them, no major figure sort of emerges really. Maybe you could argue Paul probably emerges. Marcion's the first guy to emerge on the scene. You could argue that we know about with something radically different from quote-unquote orthodoxy. So that's one of the reasons why he's such a, like, for Christianity 101, it's why he's so important, because when a lot of orthodox stories start, we have this golden thread of, Jesus arrives, and then we get to Paul, and, but then Marcion arrives. Like, it's sort of the breaking of the golden church. In fact, Hippolytus says that the church used to be a virgin until Marcion arrived. So that sort of gives you an idea right there how important this guy is. One of the reasons why he's really important is because he seems to have set up a rival movement against the proto-Orthodox Church. That he seems to have thought that the gospel of the Orthodox Church was corrupted, and it's time to bring back the true gospel. And if you guys aren't coming with me, I'm sure as hell going to do it without you, because I need to save the gospel. And it appears from the 2nd, 3rd, and even 4th century, there were people who respected and agreed with Marcion in big numbers.
If I may, I think that the reason why Marcion really is important is because he was the first person to attempt to compile a canon, and it scared the shit out of the existing orthodoxy, and it spurred them to actually create a canon. If it wasn't for Marcion, they would have taken a lot longer to actually establish a canon. And secondly, he's really, really important because I think that Walter Bauer demonstrated, I think, beyond reasonable doubt that in many places in the empire, in the Roman Empire, especially in the eastern provinces, the very first form of Christianity that many of those people were exposed to was the Marcionite variety.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that, well, I'll talk about it later once we get to that part. But
yeah, basically, I like what Leon's talked about. Another reason why Marcion, as far as we know, Marcion is the guy who was like, hey, these books are, interesting. Let's put them together. He's the guy who came up with the genius idea of putting these dynamite documents together and calling them authoritative. Clearly they were authoritative in some sense, but Marcion's the guy who puts them together and makes them authoritative as a book, as scripture, you could say. It's difficult to explain, sorry listeners, because there's a lot of overlaying stuff and we have a lot of terminological issues, but sort of what Badoon talks about it, Marcion's the father of the Bible, nobody likes to admit.
So I think this is a good point to segue into section 1 of Moll's thesis on what are our sources about Marcion and what are the problems with each.
Yeah, this section really mainly highlighted the ones that he said are under heavy dispute, right? That's the sense I got.
Well, he basically talks about all the typical ones like Tertullian and Irenaeus and Justin, and he briefly touches on why they're the important sources, but like Doug talks about, his major writing is all about the ones that are disputed and brought up, particularly some of the ones Hoffman uses for the early datings get brought up.
Right. And I don't know much about these sources, but I didn't have any major glaring problems that I saw with some of his, like the thing with the elder and Irenaeus. I thought he was good on that, talking about how it's not obvious that it's even referring to Marcionism. It could be, or it could be referring to him and a bunch of other heresies like Gnosticism or Docetism of any form. That was one thing I remember that I liked.
Yeah, Moll does a really good job with Irenaeus in particular, that because Irenaeus is writing against a catch-all, and if anybody reads Irenaeus, he attacks heresies left, right, and center. It sometimes can get really tough to follow who exactly he's fighting against, because something that's important to Irenaeus is the genealogy of heresy, that it's like, sort of in Irenaeus' mind, all the heresies beget one another in a weird genealogical sense because they all go back to Satan. So that's why it can get really confusing about who and what heretic and heresy Irenaeus is talking about.
Right, yeah.
And they... Sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, there seems to be a tendency, and I don't think it's demonstrated, to like the whole thing about everything going back to through Cerdo, Cerdo, and then back to Basilides, and then all the way back to Simon Magus. I think that's a polemical, rhetorical touch. I don't think that's an actual fact.
Yeah, definitely.
I agree with that big time.
Yeah,
back to Simon Magus thing.
That's his. Irenaeus loves that genealogy. He loves that it can go back from Marcion to Creo to Simon Magus to Satan. He loves that.
Yeah, that's a dead giveaway to me.
Because the flip side for Irenaeus is the apostolic link. Irenaeus starts to formulate a little bit, not as formal as we get later, but Jesus to Peter to that's when you can see the flip side of it. We have this like genealogy of heresy, but we have the genealogy of orthodoxy, which Irenaeus starts to develop.
Yeah. And I think Moll definitely points out that that those kinds of polemical stances are not reliable at all. Like when he talks about the connection specifically Irenaeus with Simon Magus. I think he just dismisses that as obviously not reliable due to the bias there.
Yeah, but he seems to believe the pseudo link. He seems to believe he seems to believe the pseudo link, and I think that's not a very strong case.
Well, what I liked about the pseudo-link thing was that it seems like we've got at least a few sources that all, in some way, they're positing some kind of relationship between Pseudo and Marcion.
Yeah.
And Moll was really careful. He's like, we don't know what the connection was. He kind of says, well, when we look at all this stuff, it seems like, well, maybe they just had similar ideas. It doesn't really seem like one was a teacher and one was a student necessarily. But it said, like he says, we have several sources that do make that connection between.
Yeah, but I think they all go back to Irenaeus, and therefore there is no multiple attestation. I think they're all getting it from Irenaeus.
I guess that's a possibility. Yeah.
That's where I agree with you. I agree with you, Leon, that I think the pseudo link, I didn't really buy into it. The fact that it is multiply attested is interesting, because even if they do go back to Irenaeus, which I'm not sure if they do, that would be a very interesting question to explore, if they're independent or not. It is interesting that even though they might go back to Irenaeus, they do say different things about their relationship, which is interesting. And I know that's not crazy that they change it, because we know Matthew and Luke are related to Mark, and they have no problem changing things as it suits them.
Right.
But it is. I don't really buy Marcion having a relationship with this person, or even existing. But I think Moll does a good enough job. Once again, he doesn't really invest that much into it, like Doug talked about.
Yeah, this brings up a really good point. I would like to see an actual monograph and not a thesis. I think that I would like to see an actual case being built. It seems to me to just be kind of cursory about it.
I mean, is such a thing possible? It seems like we barely have anything on this guy.
Well, I think the opening line, which he quotes Harnack, is pretty like a biography on Marcion is impossible. I think Harnack's quote is, yeah.
Yeah, but I'm not necessarily talking about a biography, but I mean, I'd like to see a monograph which would just elaborate a little bit more. I think it's too cursory.
I think I know I'm way skipping up now, but I think Moll's concluding thoughts on the life of Marcion, I think they represent pretty well how much somebody can know about Marcion. That he probably was from Pontus, maybe Sinope. He came to Rome with this interesting idea. Eventually, he falls out and goes his own way. I know that's very tangential, but and he probably was a shipmaster in some way. Moll basically sums up everything we can probably know about Marcion in a paragraph, and it's kind of depressing. That's the thing I find so depressing about this. We go for this really big source summary and source investigation and all these different tangential questions about the life and education and wealth of Marcion, only to end with this depressing paragraph.
Yeah.
But, that's
a big question.
History.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think. Sorry, go on, Wayne.
I got a big question here. I'm looking at the section 1 of Moll here, a problem with sources, and just looking through what sources he talks about. He talks about Polycarp. He talks about Ptolemy's letter to Flora. He talks about the elder in Irenaeus. And he talks about the Carmen Adversus Marcionitis. Now, who is that written by? I missed that here. It's anonymous. Is that why there's no name?
Which one?
The Carmen. I missed who that was supposed to be written by.
I'm not sure. Apparently it comes from 400.
Yeah. But the thing that struck me as very interesting is we were reading Badoon's book at the same time, and Badoon's sources seem to be quite a different list, but they have Tertullian in common. But Badun then mentions Epiphanius. Badun mentions Adamantius. Pseudo-Ephraim A. Acts of Archelaus.
Yes, but
why is there such a difference here in these lists?
Pretty easy, because some of the sources which Badun points out are only really interested in Marcion's text. Whether what Moll is interested apparently in the sources, from what I can get, is reconstructing Marcion's life details of biographical information. I do agree that he probably could have at least maybe mentioned some of these other ones, but he does in the back, in the bibliography with his main sources. I think he does include them, particularly in chapter 4, when he does get to talking about Marcion's New Testament in chapter 4. He does bring up more sources and how they relate to the Marcionite canon. But I definitely see where you're going, Wayne. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. That was my idea too. Is that some of them just don't talk about his life that much. But I thought Epiphanius did talk more about. I haven't read him firsthand, but I mean, he did talk more about Marcion. So I'm really surprised that name wasn't mentioned on Moll's list.
Yeah, I'm in your boat as well, where I need to read a lot more of these sources firsthand myself. I've read Against Marcion by Tertullian, but it's a big book to keep in your head.
Can I ask a question for Leon and for Wayne? What's the dating? How do they place the dating of Marcion, Knox, and Badun?
It's been a while since I read Knox, so I can't be all too specific, but he's definitely Knox was, I think, one of the first people to date Acts into the 2nd century, and to posit that the book of Acts was a response to Marcion, and so I think, I'm not sure about the dates though. The date of 144 is kind of standard in scholarship, of him being in Rome.
Yeah.
But of his activity before Rome, I don't think Moll makes a good case. Moll seems to think that Marcion started in Rome, and I don't think that he makes a good case.
And to answer you about what Badun thinks, he says here, pages 12 and 13 of this book, from all this information, we can place the broader dates of Marcion's life at approximately 95 to 165 CE, but we'll continue to use 144 CE as the one certain date connected with Marcion, and therefore the first New Testament. And I think Badun on this particular point is pretty much just going with what Moll says.
Yeah, he is. Badun, because Badun's book is not related to Marcion the man, his preliminary chapter is very, it's very basic, and he does cover a little bit about what other dates have been proposed, but he sides with 95 to 65.
Yeah, I don't think Hoffman. I think Hoffman might be going too far in making him be born in 70. Harnack said 85. Badun seems to think 90 or so. But I think that Moll is choosing. I don't like his reasoning for saying that he was born between 100 and 110. He kind of says, and that may be true for all I know, but I don't think his argument is good.
I think Badun was just hedging, making it 95. I think he actually thinks more of a date in the first decade of the 2nd century.
I agree with you, Wayne. I think he's kind of he's trying to get a happy medium going on. But
Sorry, laughing at Ruben.
The thing I do find. Okay, hold on. Before we get to the birth of Marcion, do we have any more questions or comments on Moll's comments on the sources?
Yeah, I thought we could maybe dive into them a little more. I wanted to see what you guys thought about each one of them, if you had any thoughts, because I had some on each one of the 4.
So
yeah, let's do that.
Say, Doug, you go right ahead, mate. You want to start with Polycarp?
The first one. I liked his argument in that section. I thought that he starts out with a big quote out of the Epistle to the Philippians, and goes through this whole line of argumentation that, is this part referring to Marcion? Is this part not? And like one thing in particular, I guess I forget the guy's name. Was it Meinhold? Yeah, Peter Meinhold. Yeah, was saying, well, it sounds like it's talking about. Well, let me just read it for the sake of the audience. It's real short. The actual part from the Epistle of Philippians by Polycarp. He says, "Let us be," and this is, some scholars are saying this is, if not directly intended to be anti-Marcionite, at least inclusive. Like it's aimed in that direction and at other people like Marcionites. Let us be zealous for the good and refrain from offenses and from the false brethren and from those who bear the name of the Lord in hypocrisy and lead foolish people astray. For everyone who does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is an antichrist, and whoever does not confess the testimony of the cross is of the devil, and whoever manipulates the words of the Lord according to his own desires and says that there is neither resurrection nor judgment, this one is the firstborn of Satan. And what I really liked about Moll's disagreement against Meinhold was that last part. When you read the first part, it does kind of sound like Marcion, as far as what we're being told by like Irenaeus or whoever, saying that Marcion was a redactor. Right. It says, and whoever manipulates the words. But then you read the second part, according to his own desires, and says that there is neither resurrection nor judgment. But Marcion definitely didn't edit them in that direction. So yeah, it doesn't. I really like that Moll pointed that out. Like, yeah, it sounds like the first half sounds like Marcion, the second half doesn't at all.
Yeah, that, and like just on its face, the name Marcion is never mentioned. Like,
right.
we from the get-go we have to stretch our imagination. Like, oh, it could be, wink, wink, nudge, nudge at Marcion. But like you said, Doug, and like Moll points out, the cross, Marcion being a good Paulinist, the cross is still central. That's clear.
Yeah, I'm obviously I'm pretty critical of this book, but I have to give him credit for that. I thought he dealt with that pretty even-handedly.
Yeah, and the one thing I did like is he addressed the firstborn of Satan, because I guess I don't remember specifically, but I guess he had said that other people had applied that moniker to Marcion before, but he still wasn't willing to. Moll still doesn't seem to be willing to say that. Well, that doesn't mean in this case it's meant to be Marcion, because I guess he was saying that was a term that was more widely used. It wasn't, even though it had been used for Marcion, it wasn't exclusive to as a label of Marcion.
Yeah, that could have just been one of his favorite insults. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
For those of you listening who don't know what exactly we're talking about, Irenaeus reports a famous story of Polycarp, this famous early church legendary figure who goes to Rome and he hears about this wild heretic running loose because Marcion's so popular. And Marcion is sort of like strutting his stuff and being all like, look at me, I'm awesome. And he goes up to Polycarp all proud and says, oh, do you recognize me? And Marcion's all proud and boastful. But Polycarp says, I do recognize you, firstborn of Satan. So it's like this really famous encounter between these two bit larger than life heretic and holy man. And it's that phrase, firstborn of Satan, that gets, in terms of Christian mythology, gets so attached to Marcion. So that's the story we're talking about when we talk about this.
And yeah, I think that Moll was pretty even-handed in why he thinks that that's not necessarily conclusive.
Yeah, I like that in that particular source.
So what is John presenting now?
I do know the firstborn of Satan. Yes. Does thou know me? Yeah, great. It's a great little encounter.
Oh, this is the actual thing from this is Irenaeus. This is the part Daniel was talking about.
Yeah, I was definitely embellishing the story, but that's basically the gist of it.
Yeah. Anything else on that first source? You guys want to go to Ptolemy's letter to Flora? I don't want to rush us along super quick, but I just want to know if we should go to the second one or if anyone had any more on the first one.
I do got a question. I guess I'll have to throw it to Daniel, who can answer it. If we don't accept Polycarp's second letter as really being about Marcion, what do we lose? I mean, what are some scholars are claiming we could learn from Marcion from that source?
That's a good question, Wayne.
Yeah. I wish I could answer it. I don't know, because when I was doing my master's thesis on Marcion, it was on his relationship to Gnosticism. So, like, these sorts, while I did look at a lot of the sources, these ones weren't of particular interest to me. But in terms of what we lose, I suppose the only thing I could guess, and this is just me off the top of my head, I suppose it does put more damage in that sort of orthodox, neo-orthodox story between Polycarp and Marcion. Like, people do love that story being historical, but it's just another proof if it's not, you know. And that's probably one of the things we quote-unquote lose. But the question then turns, like, who is it about then? And it seems that this Meinhold thinks that it's about Docetus in some respect.
Yeah, I think he's right.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought Meinhold was the guy that was saying that he thought it was thoroughly anti-Marcionite.
Oh yeah, he did.
And that Moll was saying no, Meinhold, you're wrong.
Yes. Sorry about that.
Hold on. I need to open the book. Hold on.
No, you're right, Doug. Sorry, listeners. Meinhold's the guy who thinks it's anti-Marcionite.
The other thing too was the thing about for everyone who does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. I think that I totally agree with Moll that just obviously seems to be anti-docetic, whatever brand you're thinking of, you know?
Yeah, which
right.
Like Marcion could be included in that if Marcion was the Docetus, which I think it's pretty clear he probably was in some respect. But because it's really the cross and resurrection that kind of give it away that it's not anti-Marcion.
Yeah, and it looks like the character of this whole statement is kind of just it seems like it's just a broad anti-heresy statement, basically. You know, if you don't accept these quote-unquote orthodox tenets, you're a heretic, you know.
Yeah, you are one of the first one of Satan. Like this one is the first one of Satan, so don't be that one.
Yeah. So you guys want to go to the second one, or anything else on that first source? Ptolemy's letter?
Let's go to the letter.
Any thoughts on that?
Now, I have to say I'm a little embarrassed that I haven't heard of this letter prior to reading Moll.
Me either.
Me neither. I say me neither until, I read Moll early last year, so I got it. I knew what you guys did. But no, I didn't know about this letter either. But it's interesting because none of us have heard about it, and Moll thinks that it gives us a window into Marcion's theology, which is very exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'm also thinking this is not the same Ptolemy that's the astronomer, right? Just to get that out of the way first. It's probably a different Ptolemy.
Yeah,
there were tons of Ptolemies,
Yeah, Ptolemy was 500 BC or something.
Okay.
Did you guys want to talk about this one in detail, or other than to say that Moll thinks gives us, like you said, a window into Marcion's theology?
Do people want me to tell people what it is?
Yes.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, this is from that ever-revival source, Wikipedia, but, until the discovery of the Gnostic works among the hidden cache of Nag Hammadi, few authentic Gnostic works had survived. One of them had been the Letter to Flora from a Valentinian teacher, Ptolemy, who was known from the writings of Irenaeus to a woman named Flora. The letter itself is only known inside Epiphanes, I can't pronounce it, the medicine chest, in an unsympathetic context. So that's where he gets it from. So it's the letter itself is referenced inside the Pararon, the medicine chest.
One thing I wasn't quite clear on was this, whether it's talking about, or whether it's making a conclusive statement on divorce. Did you guys? I kind of got lost in all that at the very beginning.
I need to kind of relook at this.
Basically, he's saying it's surprising. He's talking about a scholar, Lampa, or Lampa, I don't know how you'd say it in German, Lamp, I don't know, if he's even German. It is surprising that Lamp maintained that the letter contained no direct conclusion as to the question whether it is legitimate for Christians to get divorced. For how could anyone interpret Ptolemy's statement that the law of Moses, which allows divorce, was contrary to the law of God, which forbids divorce, other than in the way that divorce was against the divine law and thus forbidden for Christians? And the connection here is that there's in one of Justin's apologies, there's, I guess, talk about this woman a story about this woman who's asking, I guess, about whether or not she should get divorced, right? And the whole point is trying to place Ptolemy in Rome, I think, at the same time as Marcion. Is that right? This whole thing I kind of got confused on. That's why I kind of threw it open to you guys first.
Well, basically, it's the reference is to this person who believes that there's the adversary, the devil, the enemy or whatever, is the maker of the universe. And like, ding, 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 oh, evil God. That's, Marcion believes in an evil God who is the maker of the universe. However, the issue is, well, a lot of Gnostics do as well. But then we've got to keep in mind that Gnostics, Marcion is thrown in with the Gnostics pretty on. But the main thing is that because of the dating of the letter, he thinks that it's a reference. Because he thinks the letter is from the middle of the 2nd century, he thinks I think that's why he thinks the two God thing, one evil creator of the universe, is a reference. And also the whole law of, the like you said with the divorce thing, that there's the law of God and the law of the scriptures or whatever, the law of the Old Testament, and that definitely seems to ooze of Marcionite ideals. So I think it's those things put together is enough to make him think. I'm not saying I'm not convinced. I'm sort of like, I feel like more work has to be done than just rather 5 pages. It would make for a very good journal article for somebody to study this and come to a conclusion.
Yeah, that's what I thought at the end of it. Like, I got kind of turned around on a lot of this stuff in it, but basically by the end, I was kind of thinking like, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and it does seem like there's some strengths in saying that it's a look into Marcion's doctrines, but I don't know, it seems like not quite so
clear.
Yeah,
it seems, I'm not saying it seems weak, but it just seems, I don't know what to make of it. It's really, I haven't read, the problem is I haven't read the alternative. Like, he refers to a few people who say otherwise, but I haven't read the people who say otherwise. So, which Harnack apparently is one of them. So, yeah.
So just to clarify here, part of the issue here is that Ptolemy's letter to Flora doesn't actually mention Marcion by name.
No, he doesn't mention Marcion by name, but he mentions he mentions a person who believes that the evil one is the creator of the universe and that holds the law of the Old Testament in contempt compared to the law of God. However, looking at the footnote, that some people think that could be because the revelation of Adam and the secret book of John seem to also share these little references as well. So Harnack says that the jury's out. He thinks that he can. Yeah, Harnack describes this feast as Meinster. Oh, I'm going to translate that. It seems like the jury's out. So yeah.
Well, what I was wondering is,
I'm getting a lot of noise in the audio. Can somebody mute their mic?
Yeah, Liam, we're getting a lot of like wind noise in your mic. There we go.
The German Harnack says that this thesis is not safe, is what the German translates to. So Harnack doesn't agree with it.
Well, that's what I was curious about because you told me before we even were going to read this thesis that one of Moll's views on Marcion is that he thinks Yahweh is an evil god.
Yeah.
And is he basing that on this letter to Flora by Ptolemy?
Well, he bases it primarily on Tertullian. Tertullian is his major reference for that. But because this letter is at the same time as both of them roughly, that adds like independent source perhaps.
Yeah. Okay, I gotcha. Yeah, I'm gonna have to reread that section because for whatever reason I just didn't stick. So,
yeah. I need to read
else on that one.
We sort of covered.
Elder a little bit, yeah.
We sort of covered the Elder a little bit. But yeah. It's one of those things where I think Moll's right that it's probably not reliable, but it is interesting that it's one of the early rebuttals of Marcion.
It could possibly be.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this is the one that talks about the demiurge, right? No, I'm getting mixed up. Sorry. Okay, so did anyone have anything on that other source, the Elder and Irenaeus against heresies, as possibly being about Marcion? No. Okay.
I'm assuming all of these texts are probably available online. They're ancient texts, so they're probably all somewhere online.
Yeah, I think.
Do we find them all in one repository altogether, or do we have to search separate places for them?
Early Christian writings might have some of this stuff. I'm not sure if they have a lot of the patristic stuff, though, or some of this random stuff. I don't know. Yeah, John says on the side, well, John's quoting Moll. This is Moll. Finally, we should not exclude the possibility that Justin simply did not, this is kind of on the last one, Justin simply did not know who he was dealing with here. There is no hint in the text that he actually witnessed the events he is reporting, so maybe he just heard a story about the martyrdom of a certain Christian called Ptolemy without being aware of his Gnostic doctrine. And earlier says Moll's thesis is that Justin probably doesn't know Ptolemy is a Gnostic heretic. Yeah, okay. Then, do you want me to read these, John, or do you want to say them? I'm assuming you're trying to save your voice.
I assume I'm not going to read them.
Okay. He also says this is probably one of those cases. Oh, sorry, that's a.
It's just a random thought.
Yeah, where Moll says there can, however, hardly be any doubt that we are dealing with a Marcionite position here. Rome 150 AD is exactly page 31 when and where Marcion's star was on the rise. Yeah, so he's saying that because this is on the third one again, right? The elder thing.
It's still under Flora.
Oh, okay, sorry, Flora.
Yeah. Page, what, 30? 29, 30.
Yeah. So again, yeah, that one, who knows? Moll definitely seems to be pretty certain that it's referring to Marcion because of the timing. But
yeah, just the overlap of timing is kind of flimsy in my estimation.
yeah, it doesn't seem like it's that much to go on. But yeah. Anything on the third one, Daniel, since you're back, the elder thing, or since we already talked about it a little bit? Okay, you're muted, by the way.
I have faith in you, my children.
Okay, and the Carmen, Italians versus Marcionites, that's right, is that right?
Well, all of these sources, I had trouble, so I haven't actually read the sources themselves, remembering all the details and stuff, so quick summaries of each would actually be helpful for me still.
This one was talking about the Marcionites explicitly, right? But the main thing was the dating of it. How early can we date it? And actually, right at the beginning, he made a good point on, contrary to one scholar named Pullman, she suggested that, I think it's a she, yeah, Carla Pullman, saying that because it contains a particular Latin form of a Hebrew word, right, called phase, and that the first appearance of that is in, I forget, I'm trying to like read it. The Vulgate, right? So she says it must be post-Vulgate because the first appearance of that term is in the Vulgate, and since this document, the Carmen Adversus Marcionitis, contains that word, it must be post-Vulgate. But he's saying that she's presupposing that the Vulgate is the first place it appears, rather than say this document could possibly actually be, if not the first, at least an earlier source of that word. So that, I thought he made a good point, that she's kind of, that particular scholar is having like a bit of a circular argument and trying to give it a at least date as far as the age of it.
I think it's interesting that later on that Thomas Ravexu, thanks for the translation, that because these phrases, like, they're so similar to, like, quote unquote, the mainstream, Orthodoxy's mainstream interpretation of Gnosticism, and how much Gnosticism and Marcionism has sort of like used in the mindset of the Orthodox, that might be one of the reasons why it's got a later date, because the Marcionite systems and the Gnostic systems seem one and the same at this point. Just on a different note, because something what Wayne talked about before, about these actual sources, a lot of us are all familiar with the New Testament, and one of the good things about the New Testament is that a lot of the books are quite easy and short to read. When we look at things like Against Marcion by Tertullian, they're 5 huge books. They're massive, and it can take a long time. and I would highly recommend people read them, but they can be a bit daunting. So a good book I can recommend that helped me when I was first getting started in my undergraduate studies is called The Earliest Christian Heretics, Readings According to Their Opponents. And basically what it is that it breaks the chapters up into like Marcion, Valentinius, Simon Mangus, and basically collects a lot of important references to them, but long references, and explains who the source is, who wrote it, things like that. And it's just a really good way to sort of get used. It's a good like trainer wheels before you start reading against Marcion in its fullness. This gives you like a full big chapter of it. So this is the sort of thing I would recommend people to start with. And another good book is called A New Eusebius that does the similar thing. So that's just, I just want to throw that in there if people were really daunted by what we're referring to.
Thanks so much for that.
Yeah, that's really useful. The earliest.
I'll get the link and.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
So that was really helpful for me in my undergraduate studies. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
So anything else on this Italians versus the Marcionites? Seems like it's all coming down to the dating of it, whether or not it's reliable as a source of accurate. The other good point that I remember was, which I thought this was really strong, was the character of the if you want to call it a polemic against Marcionism. It doesn't seem to be. I'm sorry. Moll's arguing for an earlier date, and one of the reasons he gives is, whereas some of the later patristic writings are writing at a, it seems like they're writing at a more distant time period when Marcionism isn't around anymore, and it's almost like he describes it as, it looks like they're writing it like it's an encyclopedia entry. They're not going out of their way to really, make a defense against it and an outright attack on these heresies, specifically in this one, Marcion. But in this writing, Italians versus the Marcionites, it does have that impassioned flavor to it, where it looks like, that whenever this was written, Marcionism was still alive and well, because the author seems to be really preoccupied with not just counteracting Marcionism, but also trying to guard other Christians in counteracting Marcionism. It's trying to guard other Christians from being like sucked into it, like it's an actual real present threat. So I really thought that distinction that he made there was really a powerful argument in his favor. If that made any sense, sorry. Did that make any sense? I hope I said it right.
No, I think it's good.
Okay. So, you guys have anything else to say on that one? Basically, Moll's saying it's probably earlier than a lot of scholars have dated it due to, like, the phrase it contains and then this other thing I mentioned. That's basically what he's saying. So it's more useful than a lot of scholars might think, because it's not as late as they think.
I think that wrapping up this section, when we're on the conclusion, I think it's one of those things where, just like, unlike some other heretics, say, like someone like, hypothetically like Simon Mangus, who is most likely, far more likely to be like a literary invention. The details we have about him are so varied and so mute and mystery and clearly written polemically. It is really interesting that Moll points out that our sources on Marcion are actually, we actually have quite a bit to go on. Not as much as we would like, but compared to some of these other heretics, we actually have a bit to go on.
Yeah. So even though we don't know that much about Marcion, we know we still have more about him than we do from a lot of the other heretics, basically.
Yeah.
And they agree with each other fairly much, right? We don't have a lot of disagreements between these sources.
Yeah, we get a general outlook on them. It's not like, well, this guy says that Marcion believes in 3 gods, and this guy thinks that Marcion believes in 2 gods. It's enough for Moll to sort of paint a picture. You know, he can't take a photograph, but he can still paint a picture.
Yeah. That's the interesting thing, too. Yeah, like they agree that he was in, most of the sources agree that he was in Rome, you know, at roughly the same time. They seem to agree that he was from Pontus. They're not sure how geographically specific that is. It may refer to like that area along the Black Sea or something more specific. But yeah, a lot of his biographical details there seems to be true multiple attestation there.
In terms of getting now to Marcion's life, to the final section of what we were reading, I'm not saying we need to wrap up or anything, but I will be leaving soon. I think Moll reconstructs, like I said earlier, I think he does a pretty bang-up job with the guesswork. A lot of it is guesswork, a lot of it is tangential, a lot of it is like running through murky waters, but I really liked particularly some of the stuff with his education, where it's like, you know, even if Badun, for example, is right, that he didn't really touch the Apostolicon or the Evangelion, like, he still could read them. So what does that tell us right there? Like, this guy can read and probably write. So right there, that is something noteworthy in itself. So we need to guess about, you know, was he educated? And the thing I found most interesting was the section, which I'm jumping over one, I know, but was he raised a Christian? And we know we have that clearly polemical story about his father being a bishop and him getting excommunicated for sexually assaulting a virgin in his church. But it is an interesting idea, because most of the data we have at this point, we have people like from the New Testament who are being converted. They're being converted to the faith. Marcion may have been one of those Christians who was born in a quote-unquote Christian household. So that in itself is really interesting to think about. So yeah.
Yeah.
No, I thought that Moll's reasoning here was a bit. I don't know. I didn't go along with it that Marcion would have only turned against Christianity in this way if he had been raised in a Christian household. I was thinking in particular of Aleister Crowley, who was recruited to the Golden Dawn. I guess people know who that is.
Yeah.
And he said he was sworn to secrecy with terrible oaths, and then they confided to him the Hebrew alphabet. And so the point here I'm making is that Marcion could very well have been converted to Christianity some point along during his travels, right? He's a ship's owner, right?
Yeah,
so he's traveling around. He becomes converted to Christianity. He starts reading the scriptures and talking to people as he goes from port to port. And then sometime along the way, he gets a copy of the Septuagint. And, you know, he gets a whole different view of what the Old Testament God is like, and the whole foundation for the religion that he's embraced. And he becomes angry and feels cheated. And so he lashes out and creates his own sect, which is actually what Crowley did too, in opposition to the Orthodox Church, because it didn't really match up to his ideals of what he had thought the new religion was going to be.
I don't think Moll really. I don't think Moll paints a picture of him. Oh, I didn't get that, Shauna, of painting a picture that he was backlashing against his his parents or anything. I think the question Moll is raising is if Marcion was raised in a quote-unquote Orthodox household, when does this new idea emerge? And it is interesting that Moll points out, we get something like the letter of Barnabas, and if people know that letter, that is that's one of these like apocryphal documents that is just steeped in anti-Judaism. Like it specifically calls like the Jews the Christ killers. Like, so if he was exposed to something like that, right, which we don't know, but like you kind of have an idea of the cocktail that may have been formulating. But like Moll points out, we just don't know. We really don't know.
Actually, I'm not sure. I can't put my finger on the actual passage, but Moll does say that he felt like Marcion's extreme, the word he uses was despite against the Old Testament God could only be explained by his having been raised in this milieu and then rebelling against it, rather than it being something that a convert might adopt and then later on reject. And in fact, he seems to think that if you're going to be a convert, you would never reject what you were converted to. And that's another part of his reasoning that I don't really follow as being all that solid.
So any Doug or anybody?
Yeah, actually, I was going to say in this whole section there was two spots specifically where I felt like it was really treading on thin ground, or whatever the expression is, and this was one of them. Like I thought he made a reasonable argument that I could see where he's coming from. It's obviously his opinion on the evidence we have. To him it makes more sense given the doctrine that eventually came to be Marcionism, that to Moll it looks like he probably came out of a Christian background. But yeah, I see what you're saying, Sean. It's not really conclusive, and it's not even really necessarily more probable than an alternative that he was converted. And the other one too. I don't know if do you guys want to do these in order, like as far as each point of this?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Okay.
I want to interject something there, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the question of whether he was like raised Orthodox and then rejected it, I just find the question anachronistic myself. I think this is still a formative period in Orthodoxy and stuff, and I don't think there actually really was an Orthodoxy at his time to be rejected.
Yes, and that's where I really agree with you. I really agree with that, Wayne, where I agree with Shauna that I think he does make some pretty big claims, but I guess for me, where I agree with Wayne in particular is if he was exposed to a mule that had a document or a mindset like the letter of the Epistle of Barnabas that is really anti-Jewish and really sort of hate-filled to Jews, then he's not being raised in a quote-unquote proto-Orthodox environment. He's being raised in a different form of, he's being raised in a Christian variety, because there is no Orthodoxy right now. So who knows what sort of background he was exposed to. So yeah, even if he was raised Christian, that doesn't mean he was raised the right, the quote-unquote right sort of Christian.
Yeah. The other point, and since we're on this section, I think we should just stick with it, and then we can go back to the first point, which is where he was born. But one more thing on this one was whether or not he's Christian. Was I thought he did bring it up about, but I thought he dismissed it a little too easily, not effectively. Was there was he's saying that there was a common tendency, and I don't remember if it was one author or several of them to the church fathers to say that all these heretics were originally Orthodox and then splintered off later. And I feel like the same thing could be going on here, and I didn't feel like Moll really convinced me that thoroughly that that's not what's happening here.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because speaking of Marcion again, Judith Liu and she's working on a new book on Marcion called Marcion, The Making of a Heretic, and her thesis in that book, when it comes out, the blurb basically tells us that her view is that Marcion becomes the cookie-cutter mold for heretics. That, sort of what you just pointed out there, that because Marcion is viewed as this guy who was in orthodoxy but rejects it and creates heresy, in her opinion, Marcion becomes the prototypical heretic that all heretics then fit into. It's being published by Cambridge.
Well, interestingly, that's kind of what Marcion says at the end of this section. He's saying that if this, he basically says, yeah, I think this is right. It makes the most sense that Marcion probably came out of some kind of Christian background, and then developed his own unique doctrine. But at the end, he says, finally, it should not go unnoticed that it is exactly this break within Marcion's biography, that is the break being from orthodoxy, that Moll's convinced, or says probably happened in his opinion.
What's interesting is Tertullian uses language to talk about Marcion that's really it gets lost, because Tertullian says, Marcion thinks my gospel is corrupted, and I think his gospel is corrupted. So right there, they're referring to each other as having gospels, and as being corrupted. So right there, sort of to what Wayne is talking about, clearly orthodoxy has not emerged right there. So who knows what form of Christianity Marcion sprung out of, was introduced to, was converted by, was persuaded by. So yeah.
If we base it on what New Testament text Marcion had, with just the Gospel of Luke and the 10 letters of Paul, that would mean, if Hebrews was written early, that he did not accept or have Hebrews in his church. If Revelation was written early, that he didn't have Revelation in his church. So so we already have, if these books are as early as we think they are, and already a split in Christianity of different groups having different New Testament texts, in the early 2nd century, then only till later on do we have groups that actually use all these texts together.
Yeah. I think Hermann's point in Lost Christianities is really important, and this is the note I'm going to end on, because I've got to. It's 10 o'clock in Kansas, and I don't want to keep my wife up. But I think Hermann's point that too often we sort of read these heretics like, how could they come to these conclusions? How could Marcion think there were two gods? Or how could, doesn't he know that this is the way it's meant to be? And too often we sort of read our 21st century orthodoxy, we read the victor's side into Marcion. And something I really appreciate Hermann pointing out, Badun pointing out, is that when we sort of strip that away and we pick up something like Galatians, there are all sorts of conclusions that are not as crazy. Elaine Pagels and her Gnostic Paul, she's just guys, it's here. Gnostics could have gotten to their crazy, quote-unquote, crazy conclusions without any of the other stuff. They had it right there. Marcion could have gotten to his conclusions with the versions of the documents we have, even. So I think that's something really important, and I think it's why it's pretty understandable why people like ourselves and Harnack can be sympathetic to Marcion, because we like those untold stories.
Yeah, and it's important to distinguish between the interpretation, the documents that survived and got in the canon, and the interpretation of those documents. Like you said, you can get Gnosticism out of John's Gospel. You can get, like you said, you don't need these crazy Gnostic Gospels. You don't need Nag Hammadi texts to get Gnosticism necessarily. So yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thanks again for a great hangout, and I'm loving that we're talking about Moll, and I'm really excited to keep going, and I'm looking forward to listening to this in the morning. So don't have too much fun without me, guys.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for joining us, Daniel. Really appreciate having you here.
Daniel.
So, did anyone have anything else to say on Marcion's Christianity or lack thereof in his earlier days?
I haven't gotten it straight in my head yet what I think on that, but I don't think there was an orthodoxy at the time, but I think he's just part of formative Christianity. I mean, he had access to the letters of Paul and stuff and the gospel, and he tried to interpret them the best he could.
Yeah.
I'm not really convinced he actually went, a change of faith, from one view to another. I think it's just like evolution. Just gradual. I don't think there's any sudden change. No evidence for that I see.
Yeah, Leon brings up a good point too. That Moll, and I got this when I was reading it too. That Moll kind of seems to be sure that there was like an orthodoxy, some kind of monolithic Christianity at this time, which I think, yeah, we've talked about. There's a lot of problems with that view. But it seems like Moll seems to be kind of taking it for granted a little bit. At least that's the impression I got. I could be misreading it.
That's the impression I got, and that's why I made my comment about it being anachronistic earlier.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so you guys want to go back to where and when was Marcion born?
Sure.
Okay, just throw it open. Any general thoughts on that little section?
I just think that seems to be consistent among our sources, and there's very little reason to doubt it.
Yeah, the Pontus thing, like it is, like Leon said earlier when it came up, like that could cover a pretty big region. Yeah, that's true. But however widely geographically that refers to, there does seem to be some sort of agreement on Pontus.
We could do some speculation here if we follow John Marshall that Revelation was written early and that Revelation was written to the churches in Western Turkey, and that since Marcion seems to have not known about Revelation, then it appears that the view that he's actually from Central, or Eastern, or Northern Turkey is more likely in that case, and not from Western Turkey.
Yeah. The other thing too was on the dating. I didn't have much more to say about the location, but when was he born? I know, like Leon said earlier, Harnack was arguing for 85, and here Moll's arguing for anywhere from 100 to 110 roughly. But one thing I thought he was a little too quick to discard was, and I hope I'm not jumping ahead too much, it is in a different section, but it's actually directly related to this. Well, yeah, kinda. I mean, I guess it could go in either section, but Clement wrote that, let me find it. Oh, sorry, I should have had this ready. Mainly it's to do with his age. How old was he when he got to Rome, basically? And Clement in his Stromata, which I guess they dated to around 200. This is on page 58. There's one part where he says, he's talking, likewise they assert that Valentinus had heard Theodos, and he was a disciple of Paul. Marcion, who appeared at about the same time they did, indeed associated with those younger people, and he was already an old man. So Clement is saying that at this time when Marcion was around with these other heretical guys, he was already an old man, and these guys were young. So to me, that favors Harnack stating that he would be a little bit older. How old, who knows? But if he was born, say, 110, that means he'd only been 34, 35 when he was in Rome. It's not really an old man. And how young were these other guys if he was their elder, And I thought his dismissal of that was a little kind of not very powerful.
On the other hand, if he was born in 100, he would be 45. Which is gone up there in terms of, like, if the other philosophers were in their 20s or early 30s, then Marcion is going to be kind of like the old man amongst them. So,
true, yeah.
and I don't want to be armchair psychoanalyzing him too much, but you know, once people get past about the age of 50 or so, they tend to slow down physically, and it might have been a pretty energetic enterprise to actually found a church past the age of about 45 or 50.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And sorry?
No, I would just say that maybe physically it just might be more than somebody could do, but not necessarily.
Yeah, and Moll talked about that a little bit, that he was saying, like, you really get that revolutionary spirit in your younger days, you know, to be a merchant traveling around everywhere and founding a church and, you know, doing all this activity. So that's a good point.
That ties back into Moll's assumption that there's something revolutionary, though. If he's just, you know, just trying to do his best to understand Christianity that's been delivered to him, maybe there's nothing revolutionary about it.
Well, yeah, I just mean, like, I shouldn't have said revolutionary as in anti-orthodox. I should have said just founding a church. You know, obviously that would be it would be an adventure that would require a lot of your efforts, probably. Founding and overseeing a major church, administrating it, etc.
He's also supposed to be fairly wealthy too, and that often comes with age.
Yeah, but then the question is, was he born into money? Which, again, Moll says that's a possibility.
Yeah, I would say being born into money is almost certain.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was.
Educated and being a ship's owner, and the thing is, though, about that trip to Rome and that amount of money. I mean, you know, there's this huge amount of 200,000 whatever that was offered, and we have no idea if that sum of money is anything close to accurate to what Marcion actually presented to the church. And we also, I'm going to say that I have a few doubts that he ever even went to Rome, and that the entire episode that's being relayed there, I have some doubts about it. I think it might very well be polemic, because I mean, and if it is, of course, it means we know pretty much nothing about the man. But it seems odd to me that Simon Magus, he's accused of trying to buy the Holy Spirit. Paul, you know, there's a lot of comparisons of him with Simon Magus because of the whole deal where he's allowed to preach Christianity to the pagans, not make them get circumcised, as long as he sends his money back to the church in Jerusalem. So there's a little hint there that he's buying his way into the church. Now we have Marcion, and he's also being accused of the same thing, of offering up money in order to have influence over the church in Rome. And, you know, it just seems like the idea that that's just a polemic should at least be considered.
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility.
Well, I think Acts is a polemic, so and I think it may possibly be a response to Marcion.
So anything else on his age? Because I do want to do his education and profession. That's pretty quick. You guys just want to do that real quick? I don't think there'll be tons of disputing on that one. I don't know. I thought it was pretty straightforward. Did anyone have anything on that section at all? Section 3 on page 46.
Yeah, I think it's obvious that Marcion was literate.
Yeah.
But how smart and educated outside of just basic literacy is another question.
Yeah, which I think Moll basically pretty much says that, right? He's like, well, we know he had some basic level of education because he was like editing. Well, whatever. Even if he wasn't editing text, I know Moll thinks that, but even if he wasn't, he's obviously either writing text or working with text or whatever. So he seems to have at least been literate, like you said, and then Professional career, again, seems like there's one description of him being a sailor from one author and another saying he's, and let me get their names, just so people know. Yeah, fortunately, as to Marcion's profession, we have some more trustworthy testimonies. Rodin, quoted in the work of Eusebius, calls Marcion a sailor, and Tertullian, both confirming and specifying Rodin's testimony, describes Marcion as a ship owner. So, and then Moll is basically saying, well, it sounds from this that he was probably like some kind of a maritime merchant, something like that. Which I don't have any problem with that. That seems pretty good based off of what we have, you know. And it doesn't seem polemical or anything, you know.
It seems like it would be a very interesting occupation for a person who was spreading a particular doctrine around the world and founding churches.
Pretty convenient for that, yeah.
Very convenient. I kind of have a theory that he may have had some sort of let's say we agree that the visitation to Rome happened. I'm thinking it's possible he had already put together his book and he had traveled around and formed something like study groups around in the various places where he traveled and maybe regularly brought his boat in. And so he had maybe a group of like-minded friends and associates, we'll say, and this wonderful new scripture that he had put together, and that's what motivated him to go to Rome. That here he had something wonderful to show to them and to bring to them, and when they saw his wonderful way, you know, his wonderful new theology and his wonderful new scripture, they would jump right on it. And then, you know, when he brought them, say, sold everything he had, sold his shipping business, and brought it and laid it at their feet, they would see what an awesome thing he was bringing to them. And, of course, their reaction was just the opposite. But I guess what my larger theory, though, is that when he went out and started forming his own church, he probably already had a base of support and friends that he'd been bouncing his ideas off of, at least.
Yeah. And
when
actually,
I think of captains, I think of Edward John Smith, you know, the captain of the Titanic. So whenever I picture Marcion, I'm trying to picture him, you know, being a brilliant former of religions.
And that's a perfect segue to Section 4, if anyone didn't have anything else to say on the education or occupation. Nothing?
Other than that, sometimes, to me, it's very kind of fishy that all that biography, some of it just doesn't seem to jive.
About, like, his profession or or what specifically? Or you mean more
profession? Yeah, well, specifically his profession, you know, because I think there is some critics who question that it's kind of like, you know, saying Paul was a tent maker, saying that he was a ship captain. It's kind of like that, but I don't know exactly who said that or what they said, but I'm just bringing that up. Yeah,
I think, like I said, it was just the two. I think we just have the two sources there. You Rodin saying that he was a sailor through Eusebius, and then Tertullian saying he was a ship owner. So I think that's all we have, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
What is this about? Sorry.
We're talking about a book we're reading on Marcion.
Okay, yeah, he wanted the letters of Paul and the Gospel of Luke to be only in there, right?
Right, yeah, that was his canon, yeah.
Yeah, but he is it?
Well, we have no evidence that he was aware of other Christian writings except for possibly Matthew. So
yeah.
Luke and the 10 epistles of Paul was what he had, and he developed his theology from those.
Yeah, he didn't think that Jesus was identical with the being in the Old Testament. That was something that was melded together later.
Right.
Yeah, he believed that Jesus was sent by a God, and the God he was sent by is different than the God of the Old Testament.
Yeah. I'm actually taking a course on the Christian history this semester, and the professor studied under Bart Ehrman, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. So anyway, going off of Shauna's segue here, when and where did, this is on page 50, section 4, where and when did Marcion start his movement? This one was a toughie because, like Moll says, we really don't have that much other than the Rome thing in 144, 145. What did you guys have any thoughts about, like, whether or not he did extensive or maybe even just a little bit of spreading his doctrine before he got to Rome? Because Moll seems to think that even if he did that, it probably wasn't much because he wasn't well known until after that date. There's nothing really, there's no anti-Marcionite stuff attacking him before, you know, that before he ostensibly came to Rome, you know. So I thought that was pretty good, and I know, Shauna, you said you're not so sure about that he even came to Rome. I found it basically convincing, but it's not rock solid. But I didn't see any particular reason to doubt the sources on that particular detail. But did you want to go into a little more on that since we're in that section now?
I think I pretty well explained my reasoning that I just see it as a possible polemic tool since it seems to relate to both Paul and to Simon Magus in the past. But I wouldn't feel, you know, I wouldn't go to the mat for that as an idea.
Yes, and I think the evidence is kind of slim and sketchy, but if I was to put just a hypothesis together, I would think that he did found churches, you know, outside of Rome, churches that hadn't heard of Christianity before, you know, and learning it through him for the first time. And then there were conflicts between those churches and some of the other more connected to Rome churches, and that he probably went to Rome as an attempt to try to settle those conflicts, and it didn't go well.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But whether there's any evidence for that in the actual sources is a whole different question, though.
What's interesting too is that this is the one point where, you know, Moll seems to be careful about, you know, what exactly, how certain we can be on a lot of this stuff. But this point specifically is where he feels we have the strongest evidence to go on. Not necessarily of the specific date, although he does settle on 144, 145, but that he was in Rome. But the problem is he goes into some of the sources too, like we have the Italians versus Marcionites, saying he came to Rome under the episcopate, that's the Pope, right, of Anicetus, I guess, 155 to 166. So that's later, and then Tertullian saying
Bishop.
Bishop, yeah. Thank you. Just a side note, by the way, when was the papacy actually established?
Well,
Peter,
yeah. They say it's usually with Peter, but
I was kidding.
Oh.
Talk about a polemic device.
Yeah.
Do you know if the early Christians believed in the virgin birth? Because I've seen Bart Ehrman's postings on this. It's obviously taken from Isaiah, but at least Matthew directly copied it from there. But do you know?
Tyler, are you going to be around for a while? Maybe we discuss it after this Hangout's over.
Oh, sure. Well, what is it now? Maybe 30 minutes-ish. Yeah.
Yeah, we might wrap up by then. Well, basically, we kind of go through in this Hangout, we do like a reading every week of a book we're reading, and then we discuss the reading. So we're basically trying to stick with the reading material. That's what we're trying to say nicely.
Which book is it? Sorry.
It's a dissertation by Sebastian Moll, who wrote a huge, I guess you could call it a biography on Marcion, which is available for free, by the way, in a PDF form. Ruben posted a link to it, just a few.
The Arch-Heretic Marcion.
Right, yeah. That's what we're reading.
At the left hand of Christ, the Arch-Heretic Marcion.
Okay.
And if you do want to, I mean, I don't know how regularly you're available around this time on these days, but you're more than welcome to join us if you want to do the reading or just even join in on the discussion. But
Really cool.
yeah, so
I think that Wayne's idea is really interesting. The one
It's
that
also the kind of thing we wouldn't expect to find in the sources, because if they're trying to say that he's such a horrible heretic and stuff, they probably don't want to talk about him trying to reconcile stuff from the start.
right, the whole idea was to prove that they all sprung from this one source, Simon Magus, that there was this pure Orthodox church in the beginning, and then it was corrupted by these various heretics that came along. So if you had a parallel, more or less parallel development of another church going on, it doesn't really fit their narrative.
Yeah.
yeah, and I think most of us here agree with pretty much that, right? That there's no root, so to speak, that there's just heretical branches off of. But yeah, I'm not.
And then there's the very interesting thing that Marcion calls his Jesus, Jesus Christus, rather than Jesus Christ, which is a little bit different thing. Christus being Jesus the good, and Christ being Jesus the anointed one.
He wasn't the only person to do that. There was another person who referred to Jesus as Christus.
Yeah, it's a little off topic at the moment. And we also have another problem. It's off topic, but I'll quickly do this. Our earliest manuscripts almost all use abbreviations for Christ or Christian, where they just use what's called Noma Sancta, where they just write like 2 letters. So we actually do not know what version they would have preferred for a lot of the manuscripts we have. And the earliest references we actually have it to it spelled with an I is actually 3rd or 4th century, way later in the time period. So it's even possible that all the Christians in the 1st and 2nd century spelled it with the E, Christus, not Christos. But we don't know. That's all speculative.
Interesting.
I'm pretty sure the earliest actually identified Christian enclosure turns out to be a Marcionite building and not what you would call Roman Christianity, I guess.
I wasn't aware of that.
I'll have to look that up and remember to post it in the group tomorrow or something. But I remember there being something like that.
Which pages did you guys go over?
Up to page 69.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing that he talks about on Tertullian's dating was that there's a major problem with Tertullian's dating, which is that I'll just read it. It says the dates of both Eleutherus and Telesphorus do not coincide with the reign of, and these are 2 people he's mentioning as coinciding with this guy, Antoninus Pius, but Tertullian's saying that they were coinciding, and so that makes us doubt that Tertullian really has his chronology down to be trusted, because these people weren't actually around at the same time, I guess he's saying. So that's just one other thing on the 2 sources we have that put Marcion's activity in Rome later than 144, 145. I wish I remembered more of the specifics on this section of why he's preferring that specific date.
There's 115.5 years after Christ.
Yeah, and that was
the 144 date.
Who gave us that? I forget. I think it was
Actually,
Tertullian
was it
again.
115 years after the reign of Tiberius, or did they say Christ?
It was
It's
from
between
Christ.
Christ and Marcion. And it's subject to interpretation what they mean for both days. What they mean for Christ, whether this is beginning of his ministry or crucifixion or whatever. And for Marcion, whether it's when he started his ministry or when he went to Rome or whatever.
Yeah, this is again comes from Tertullian, and it's 115 years and 6.5 months between Christ and Marcion, and this is Tertullian saying they, the Marcionites, put that much time between Christ and Marcion, which is more or less the period of time from Tiberius to Antoninus. And that would put you roughly at sometime around 144-ish or 145-ish. Depending on like what spring or summer or winter or whatever, wherever you start it in the 15th year of Tiberius' reign, which is what he's going off of what Luke's saying there. That's when.
Yeah.
I guess I would see that as possibly being one of the more reliable pieces of information we might have, because I don't really offhand see any reason why he would want to make that up. The 100.5.
Yeah, and the other thing he talks about is what's the significance of this dating? Because is it when Marcion was born? Is it when Marcion first developed his Marcionite doctrine, or is it when he first got to Rome, or was it when he founded his church? We don't know exactly, so there's some speculation on that. But there was one interesting thing that Moll talked about, which I thought was, there's all those possibilities as far as where are they putting that endpoint at Marcion, whatever that means. And I wish I knew right where it was, but yeah, right here. Again, Tertullian, he says, in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, Christ Jesus deigned to pour down from heaven a salutary spirit. This is at least the way Marcion would have it. In what year of the elder Antoninus his pestilential breeze breathed out from his own Pontus, I have not bothered to investigate. They, the Marcion, and then he says, they, the Marcionites, put 115 years, blah, 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 between the two. And then he goes in saying, okay, what are they talking about? The birth of Marcion, the arrival in Rome, first preaching, whatever. But he does make an interesting point that he prefers the, what was it, well, does anyone else have any thoughts while I find this? Because I really want to read this section. Because I thought it was good and I don't want to slaughter it by trying to...
Take a moment to find it.
Okay.
I think Moll his explanation is kind of strange here, that it just must be the date of Marcion's arrival in Rome, because that would just naturally be the most important date to Marcion and his followers. And I thought,
yeah.
Oh, I think that's where I was talking about. I think I found the paragraph. It is obvious that...
What page?
54, sorry. It's right after the quote. It's at the bottom of the page, right after the quote out of against Marcion from Tertullian. It's obvious that for Tertullian, it is these two quote-unquote arrivals which correlate. That is the arrival of Jesus and of Marcion. He knows that according to the Marcionites, it was the 15th year of Tiberius when Christ came down from heaven, but he has not bothered to investigate the correlating event. That is when it was that Marcion's, quote, breeze breathed out, quote, from Pontus. Therefore, he must rely on the calculation offered by the Marcionites. One might thus paraphrase the entire line of thought as follows. Marcion says that Christ came down from heaven in the 15th year of Tiberius. When it was that Marcion came from Pontus, I do not know, but the Marcionites say it was 115 years and 6.5 months after Christ. Yeah, that was the wrong paragraph. Dang it. But basically, he was saying, well, since if you liken the since it's being likened by the Marcionites from Christ, he's saying basically that what are they liking about Christ? His arrival on the scene, basically. And I think he was saying that, well, that actually would more go along, if you were to have a correspondence there, it would be more natural to put it with, like what Shauna said, the beginning of his ministry, basically, if you want to call it that, Marcion's.
Can I interject something?
Yeah, go ahead.
About the starting point of the 115 and a half years being from Christ, it actually says, and half a month even it has on there. So it's that specific about Christ. If our text only says the 15th year of, what was the name of that ruler, Tiberius, and this doesn't really give a month there, then that wouldn't be the right date. I mean, if the Bible in Luke gives, something for a different date, I can't remember if it gives a month in that part or not. So if there's something else in Christ's time that actually gives a month, it might be what they're going by instead. Because this never supposedly is that precise.
Yeah, I don't think it does.
I don't think it does either.
But the crucifixion of Christ is supposedly on a particular day that we can actually tie it on the Jewish calendar.
In the day after the Passover meal.
So what if it's the death of Christ and then the day of Marcion is Marcion's death?
Yeah, it could be. That's the other thing I forgot to mention that he's saying is a possible correspondence between the two things there. I can't find the darn part that
Well, it could be how much time is in between. It could be from the death of Christ to the rise of Marcion, and just counting the time in between.
Yeah, could be. There was one part where he weighed in on all those possibilities and favored one, and I thought it made some sense on my first reading, but I can't find it now.
But supposedly the 115 years is taken from the Marcionites themselves. So what kind of thing would they be talking about? Why would they use it in their own context?
That's the whole question. Yeah, like we don't know basically, other than to say there's something. There's some event in Christ's life, whether it be his birth or his death or anything in between, and some event in Marcion's life, whether it be his birth or death or anything in between, that they're using to count that window of time, and we don't know the starting point on either end of the correspondence or the end point.
We pretty know it's unlikely to be Marcion's birth, because that would make him born way too late.
Yeah. And I think he rules out his death on a similar thing too, because some author writing later about him is the particular words this author is using presuppose that Marcion's still alive. I forget the actual the author. I gotta admit I didn't take really any notes on these, so that's why I'm kind of struggling.
And going from death to death is just not the kind of thing I'd find likely to find in a Marcionite source.
Yeah.
Is it possible that Marcion was a typical kind of egotistical individual, and that he had some sort of a ceremony where he declared himself as, I don't know, supreme head of the church or something, sort of like, sort of some kind of I guess they would call it an advent, and that would be the day that they're talking about.
Could be baptism to baptism.
That's an interesting idea. But it puts his conversion rather late. It's still right around the time of when he was supposed to have arrived in Rome.
Yeah.
Not that smashes your theory at all. I'm just saying that.
I was just brainstorming. It wasn't really much of a developed theory.
It's pretty good, though.
Thanks.
Later on, too, he goes into a couple of sources that appear to, and this thing I mentioned in regards to his birth from Clement, that these two sources appear to suggest that Marcion was having some kind of activity before arriving in Rome, and the one was Clement. You're talking about how he's an old man already, compared to these younger Basilides and Glaucius or whoever, all these other guys. And he basically goes through that and says, well, there's nothing definitive that he's actually teaching before, or we have no evidence essentially that he's doing anything with his message before that. And the other one was Justin's, I believe, apology. Yeah, 153, 154. Saying that Marcion has made many people in the whole world speak blasphemies, and that he is, quote, even now still teaching. So saying that, that seems to be suggesting that a long time has passed from like the beginning of Marcion's message being sent out to when Justin's writing. But Justin's only writing 153 to 154, so that's 10 years max between when he supposedly arrived in Rome and had this widespread base, and even now is still preaching. So, but again, I think Moll basically is saying that, well, it's not really that much of a stretch to say that it could have actually spread that widely in that amount of time. I think that's basically his argument, that it doesn't necessarily give us evidence that he had like a widespread influence before 144, 145 in Rome.
Actually, my best guess for what the 115 years are probably meaning would probably be to the publication of the Antitheses. I actually think if he's going to say a certain date that's most significant, it would probably be the publication of that book or that text. That's just my guess.
That's not a bad guess. Yeah, I mean, it could have been any like major event in his career there. But yeah, that's a really good possibility.
I think no matter what, though, it offers us a pretty good anchor on when Marcion was at the height of his career or was really active, and we can say pretty safely that around the 144 to 145 time frame is pretty good.
So if we wanted to set our time machine to go back and investigate that, it's about 144 in Rome is where we want to go.
Yeah, I think that's the most that evidence can really tell us. Like, I kind of go along with Moll a little bit. I want to go back and reread the stuff about why he favors that date specifically, because I remember the dismissals he has of the other sources giving a later date of his activity or arrival in Rome, but I don't remember specifically the favoring that particular date. But yeah, I think you guys are right. At least we can say that he was having an impact at that time. That was an important date for Marcion. So, anything else on that before we go to Cerdo? His connection to Cerdo. I talked about Cerdo earlier too.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical of that connection to Cerdo because it seems to be so serving of the connection back to Simon Magus, and to satisfy the narrative that there's this genealogy of heresy that came forward from Simon Magus.
Yeah, same here, and like Leon was saying too, we have, I think, 2 or 3 sources making some connection between Cerdo and Marcion, but Irenaeus is the first one to do that, and Leon's saying, well, how do we know, or Leon said earlier that how do we know that they're not, these subsequent guys aren't all just getting it from Irenaeus, who we know had that propensity, like you said, to try and like give this genealogy of heresy. So yeah, I agree with you there. It's not exactly that strong, I don't think.
And do we really know anything about Cerdo at all, other than that?
Well, they do talk about him a little bit. That like they're saying that they had similar ideas, and that basically that Marcion kind of refined or expanded on Cerdo's views, essentially. So kind of the source we have are basically trying to tell us that like Cerdo was kind of like, I guess, a predecessor to Marcion, and Marcion kind of took off from Cerdo. But even Moll says that that particular orientation to each other isn't that certain. He's saying it could just be that they were two people who happened to be in Rome at the same time and knew each other, or maybe not, just influenced each other because they had similar thoughts, you know, so or similar thinking on those topics. Yeah, so we got three. I'm sorry, the sources we have, he says, all agree on three things, page 64. Cerdo was active before Marcion, so all these sources say these things. Two, Cerdo taught a doctrine similar to that of Marcion. Three, Marcion met Cerdo in Rome. So, but again, like Leon said, this could all just be coming from Irenaeus, so it's hard to say.
Well, I think it's going to be pretty obvious that the people who are thinking outside the box or are having ideas that don't necessarily go along with the line that the Roman Church eventually adopted are going to have some similarities. I mean, you know, people are thinking about the same scripture, the same group of ideas. A lot of different people are going to come up with the same criticisms and the same answers to those criticisms. So I guess I'm saying that they don't necessarily have to have been adopting each other's ideas. They may have, you know, when they met in Rome, found that they were like-minded in some ways.
I find that highly plausible, yeah. But,
there's the wiki on Cerdo there. Assyrian Gnostic is what they're basically saying. Deemed a heretic by the Orthodox Church, started out as a follower of Simon Magus, although I'm sure that comes from Irenaeus, so who knows if that's true? Probably not. Taught about the same time as Valentinus and preceded Marcion. So yeah. Oh, he was a prominent member of the church until his forced expulsion. Contemporary of the Roman bishop Hyginus. So yeah, I mean that link actually looks like there's some good stuff in there as far as how similar he was to Marcion from what we know from our sources, which are admittedly iffy. So anything else on that whole section, Cerdo? You guys want to go to 6? How and when did Marcion actually break with the church?
yeah.
Okay. Any thoughts on that section from what you guys can remember from it? This is actually our last section of section 2.
I'm going to say, oh, go ahead, somebody else talk.
I was just going to say, from what I remember, this is where it talks about like the 200,000. Am I getting that right? The money, or was that earlier? I think that was earlier actually.
Well, the money was involved with the break with Rome, and that's one of the interesting things is, have you ever seen a church or charity give back a huge sum of money once it's been given to them?
Yeah, I mean, who knows if that's true. If they gave it back, or if they even ever accepted it. Or
actually, my theory is that Marcion promised it, and that they broke almost immediately when he started carrying around his chopped up scripture and talking about two gods. You know, that they pretty much just said, "Oh, okay," and they, you know, just didn't even accept the money in the first place. Just said, "Yeah, we'll forget about this," and moved on.
It could all be just polemic too. It could just be money that he spent on his, with his own churches and stuff, and then they, well, he was originally one of us. He originally offered that money to us, but we declined it. So that's why it went to those other churches and stuff. But how well you trust that? The whole thing about him splitting with Rome. I mean, that's kind of a biased way of saying it. If the Orthodoxy was still being developed and stuff at that time, it might be more that Rome split with him.
Yeah, and like you say, it could all just be part of this general agenda to try and say all these heretics were once Orthodox and they just split off. So yeah.
But the Roman Church, was trying to defend its own relevancy and stuff. So it probably exaggerated the amount of difference at some point just to make itself seem more relevant.
Mm-hmm. One interesting thing that Moll points out here that I thought was pretty good was why Marcion, at least based off of our sources, seems to have been basically totally excommunicated, whereas some of the Gnostics, at least at this point, the Valentinians weren't, because, and he differentiates them. He says that the Valentinians, they were basically in agreement with the core doctrines of, well, not in every case, I guess, because, yeah, this is interesting. I'm going to have to give this some more thought, but basically that they were still within the church, but they just had this extra add-on secret gnosis bit, basically. But then you have to throw in well, they also thought they had the evil God, good God duality, and that's obviously super a big no-no for orthodoxy. So anyway, the thrust of the argument was that, well, in the case of Marcionism, it was a major departure from whatever you want to call it, orthodoxy, if you want to call it that, anachronistically. I'm just going to use it because I don't know what else to call it, but he basically, too much of his doctrine was way different, not acceptable, not compatible with the church, and Moll's saying this could have been a big factor for why Marcionism in particular, according to what he's saying here, was a big no-no and had to be thrown out of the church in a big way, bigger than these other heresies. So
maybe it was the extent of organization that was the reason why they made such a big deal about him. These other guys, little study groups that were still absorbed within the greater church, but the Marcion group, maybe they didn't assimilate like they were supposed to. And I do see that, doesn't the word Catholic mean universal?
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about the Roman Church, I sort of see an organization that meant to create a one-size-fits-all sort of religion that, offered a little something for everybody and would just assimilate all the various groups into one master religion. And perhaps, the Marcionite group was a little bit tougher to assimilate, and that's why it required, some kind of extra effort to overcome them.
Well, I think the standard thesis that the Proto-Orthodox Church then had a high respect for the Old Testament, and the fact that Marcion treated the Old Testament in a much different way than they did was probably just so incompatible that they just couldn't keep him around.
Yeah. Do you guys care? So, go ahead. Sorry.
It just seems, and that's one of the cases where the most basic theory seems to be the right one, or the most obvious one seems to be the right one.
Well, if you're wanting to assimilate all the various groups around, and Jews are one of those groups that you would really like to fold into your master church, then you're going to have to accept the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Hebrew Scripture. And that could have been a major agenda for them that Marcion was rejecting, and that they would have to say, if you're going to join up with us, you're going to have to accept the Old Testament.
Of course, Marcion accepted it, but in an allegorical way, and in a way of not being, well, it depends what part you're talking about. But in a way where he doesn't think it's actually applicable to us morally and stuff as actual rules for life and things. But yeah, he did seemingly believe that. He did believe the Old Testament patriarchs existed and things like that, yes. He took that literally, but...
Yeah, and this is where the thing between Harnack, like we were talking about earlier, Harnack and Moll are kind of differing. That Harnack's saying Marcion thought that the Old Testament was just Yahweh wasn't an evil God per se. He was just the God of law and he was the creator. But Moll seems to be saying, well, no, Marcion thought he was an evil God. But still, even though like the Old Testament's still true, it's still scripture, quote unquote, whatever you want to call it.
My point about it being taken allegorically is how we apply it to Christians' own lives. He wasn't saying you should literally do what it says to do and stuff. You go for the deeper meaning of what it says about how to live your life and stuff.
Okay. I just wanted to read one quick bottom of a paragraph on page 66 that's summing up better than I said what the why Marcion was so no for the church. He said, "What made this man so unbearable for the Roman?" Oh, and just to preface this, he was saying that at this time, according to Moll, the Roman Church basically had some level of tolerance for different like splinter groups of Christianity, and that's the background for what I'm about to read. So,
what made the splinter groups at that point? That's assuming there was a proto-orthodoxy. It's just a bunch of people with some common ideas, throwing other ideas around.
Right. Yeah, and that could be true too. I'm just going off what Moll's argument here is. What made this man so unbearable for the Roman ecclesia, if they even managed to be in communion with the Valentinians? The crucial difference is that the Valentinians did not consider the church's teaching to be entirely wrong. They just believed in some secret extra revelation only they had access to, thus being convinced of their own superior level of knowledge. The Valentinians did not mind associating with their quote-unquote ordinary brothers. Marcion was made of different stuff. He believed that the church had dangerously perverted the true teachings of Christ, and he therefore started an anti-movement. Such a man could obviously not fit within the church's usual tolerance scheme. I just thought that was interesting. But yeah, it does presuppose some kind of orthodoxy there. Of course, maybe there was some kind of orthodoxy, at least in the Roman church, you know what I mean? Some kind of groundwork there. So, because I mean, obviously you have these bishops, and you have this line of bishops, unless all these, I don't know that much about them, but there's got to be some kind of common ground there, you know what I mean?
I think it's pretty obvious that the Roman Church wanted to call the shots, and they were going to want to call the shots theologically as well.
Yeah, I don't dispute that at all.
So are we ready to wrap it up?
Yeah, I think so. Just one last thing on his death. Moll's arguing for a death around, I think, 165? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. He says the most common view is 160, an estimate which probably goes back to the thesis of Harnack that Marcion could not have lived until the time of Marcus Aurelius. Harnack based this theory on the above-mentioned report by Clement of Alexandria, who states that the era of the heretics Basilides, Valentinus, and Marcion is the time of Hadrian and Antoninus Pius. But he says it could be doubted that Clement had such specific dates in mind by naming those people as the period of the heretics there. And there was one other thing, though. Moreover, Irenaeus states that Marcion gained influence under Anicetus, 155 to 166, a statement which is most certainly untrue as to the beginning of Marcion's influence, but which indicates that Marcion was still alive under the episcopate of Anicetus. Combining this information with Clement's statements, it would be a good guess to say that Marcion died about 165. And so he basically had control of his church for approximately 20 years, which Moll's saying that's quite a long time considering other heresies, I guess you could say, or other. He says other founders of religious movements. So anyway, anything else on that whole on that section or the whole what we read? What do you guys think so far of Moll and his argumentation and all that?
I like it, and I think he's conservative enough, and I think he's quite plausible in his theories.
Yeah, I pretty much. Sorry, keep going.
I forget some of the evidence he's citing for some of the theories he's giving, which is the main point of his thesis, is to tie things to the actual evidence in the sources, and that's something we've been a little weak on in this hangout. We've been talking about the theories themselves more than the actual evidence being cited for them. And I'm at fault for that because my memory's bad, and I read this and I forget what things were.
Me too. I need to take better notes next time for sure.
Yeah, I find the sources to be extremely weak. Other than Tertullian, Irenaeus, the others are hopelessly, late in the dating, and it's a pretty sad state of affairs. And I have to say, I think the guys who have written books about Marcion have done very well with the dearth of actual information about the man.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're right. The quality of the sources is not that great, and like you said, Tertullian and Irenaeus seem to be giving us a lot of what we know, and there's problems with taking them as reliable. So yeah, it's a hard problem for sure.
I'm thinking if Moll himself went through and listened to this hangout, he may be a little bit shocked that we gloss over some of the stuff he makes so much.
Yeah. So let's just say, because like me in particular, I can't remember all the specific details of this big section of reading, but Moll is careful to go through the sources that he's pulling from and making these arguments about biographical details of Marcion and all the stuff we've talked about. He is careful to go through his arguments and other people's arguments and why he thinks the sources are useful here or not useful here, or stuff like that. So to be fair, yeah, we're not giving it, we're not doing an exhaustive treatment like he is. We're just kind of summing up his conclusions basically. But he does definitely go through all this stuff. So. Any closing words?
Maybe we should just read his conclusion because it's short, just for the sake of the people who watching. The main result of our investigation into Marcion's biography is that he has to be placed at a later phase of the history of the Church than is usually assumed. This conclusion is particularly triggered by the fact that there is not enough evidence to support the idea of Marcion's activity before the year 144-145. That's one thing we didn't discuss enough. Combined with the fact that he was raised in a Christian surrounding, this means that Marcion was familiar with a church tradition that was already fairly advanced, an element which was to have a crucial influence on the establishment of his own church. See Chapter 6.
Yeah. And we'll probably touch on a lot of this stuff in more detail as we go through more of the book. So.
Yeah, I must have forgotten what Moll's arguments were about the not having much activity before 144, because I still most naturally think that he did. But I'm just making just theories based on plausibility, though, not necessarily the sources.
On the 144 thing?
That Marcion didn't have much activity before then.
Yeah, well, remember there was those two sources that we mentioned, but Moll had problems with them as actually giving us evidence of any activity before those dates.
I mean, is Moll just giving us an argument from silence here?
I'm going to agree with you because, you know, when the band heads to the Big Apple or to L.A., it's when they've already got their act together. It's not when they're just getting things started. So I'm going to say if Marcion went to Rome, it's because he already had something to offer.
That's what I would think also, yeah. The other option is he's going there to learn more. You know, he realized he has a gap in his knowledge and wants to learn more, but that just doesn't make sense of him being so different from what they teach. Oh, I missed a paragraph reading the conclusion. We have further established that Marcion deserves, in a double sense, the title of Arch-Heretic. On the one hand, because he is the first Christian ever to be actually outside the church for doctrinal reasons. On the other hand, because his biography of a man who is familiar with Orthodox doctrine and then deliberately chooses to deviate from it would become a stereotype for future heresiologists.
I'm back, sorry. Where were you guys? I had to take care of something.
Sorry, I was reading the concluding paragraphs.
Oh, okay. Okay, so did anyone have anything else? We've been going for a little over 3 hours, so I kind of want, or almost 3 hours, I think. So I kind of wanted to wrap it up, but I don't want to cut anyone off early, so.
No, we're at a dead spot here.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming, and for anyone that is listening or will listen. And next week we'll have a little bit of a shorter reading assignment, so that'll be nice. So yeah, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you guys next week. And we're on Facebook, Society of Biblical Scholarship, so if you're interested in joining us for these readings, check us out on there, join our group, and we'd love to have more people. So anyway, see you guys next week.